Welcome to the Water Shelf Podcast, where we dive into the wonderful world of water books. The Water Shelf is a production of Maven's Notebook, California's Water News Central. My name is Justin Scott-Coe, water manager, pirate, and book aficionado. More information on the Water Shelf and Maven's Notebook will be provided at the end of this episode. It is my great pleasure to welcome Drs. Teodoro, Samantha Zuhlke, and David Switzer to the Water Shelf Podcast. Dr. Teodoro is the Robert F. and Sylvia T. Wagner Distinguished Professor in the Follette School of Public Affairs at the University of Wisconsin. Dr. Zuhlke is Assistant Professor in the School of Planning and Public Affairs at the University of Iowa. And Dr. Switzer is Assistant Professor at the Truman School of Public Affairs at the University of Missouri. These eminent scholars recently came together to write a book of immense importance to the water industry entitled The Profits of Distrust: Citizen Consumers, Drinking Water, and the Crisis of Confidence in American Government, published by Cambridge University Press in 2022. Manny, Samantha, David, I am thrilled to meet all of you and speak with you about this exciting book.
Well, thanks so much. It's delightful to be with you.
Yeah, super excited to talk.
Thanks for having us.
Well, thank you all for being here. I thought I'd start with a question of the intended audience for the book. Basically, whom do you consider to be the intended audience of Profits of Distrust? Or maybe another way of asking this might be, whom do you most want to read your book?
We try to do something pretty difficult with this book, which is to speak to two distinct audiences. On one hand, we want to speak to an academic audience. We are professors. We're trying to do serious social science theorizing and good, hard, rigorous empirics with this book. But in the end, we want this book to matter for some audience past the few dozen scholars who would be interested in these issues. We wanted to speak to water sector leaders, folks who run utilities, advocacy organizations who work in the water sector, the regulatory officials, even elected officials, the people who make the decisions. So we're trying to hit this sweet spot between those two, have the clarity and rigor and complexity that is required for an academic crowd, but also have the applicability and relatability to an applied crowd. So I'd say a year and a half, 2 years post-publication, it feels like we've hit that sweet spot for the most part. I think there are parts of the book that are more accessible to some audiences than others, but overall, we feel like it's been pretty well received.
I'd add, too, that we tried to keep that in mind when writing the book. So there's comments to readers throughout that if you are a practitioner, you can go ahead and skip these chapters if you'd like. And if you're a scholar, well, we don't give you the excuse to skip certain chapters if you're an academic, I guess.
Well, I'd say for the scholars, they can look at the 100 pages of statistical appendices that come at the end of the book that we decided not to stick in the main text.
So glad you guys brought that up because, I felt as someone who's in the water sector that the book directly spoke to me. And it's kind of one of those books that I think is so rare that it speaks so directly to the specific industry that you're in and the issues, both the benefits and the risks associated that we think about on a daily basis. So a huge compliments to all of you for bringing such tremendous knowledge and perspective to the industry, which I think is incredibly beneficial. And I'd like to hear more about the reception in a bit. Another question I kind of wanted to ask in terms of context for this book, was there a particular book or books on your respective water shelves, either physical or, electronic, that inspired you to write or even inspired you while you were writing The Profits of Distrust?
So, and I'm trying to remember the name of Peter Gleig's book, but I started writing on bottled water back in really 2015. And so Bottled and Sold definitely was a thing that I read at the time that, kind of was eye-opening in many ways. And so certainly I'd throw some credit to that from my perspective. I think another book that personally got me on the path to this actually, and it's not directly related to water, but I think it shares a lot of themes with our book, is the book Shopping Our Way to Safety by Andrew Sass. a sociologist, and his whole book is about how people are more and more choosing to purchase protection rather than engaging in collective action and relying on government for protection. He uses examples like organic food, actually suburbanization, and even going back to historical examples like the building of bomb shelters during the missile crisis, during the height of the Cold War. And so I kind of, in that, I as I'm reading more about bottled water, I'm finding a lot of themes there. I don't know if Manny or Sam have anything else to add, but those are two that immediately kind of I was thinking about a lot when we were working on the book.
I think another one is Benjamin Pauly's book about Flint called Flint Fights Back, which is very different from our book in its empirical approach, and it's very much a single case study. But that book was published as we were in the middle of writing Prophets of Distrust. And what Pauly does in that book that's different from the other treatments of the Flint water crisis that are out there is he very much ties the Flint water crisis to a failure of democracy and to the relationship between governance and the provision of this essential service. So very much tied into the themes, a single case study, qualitative analysis, very different from our approach, but picking up on some of the same themes.
I didn't have a water shelf in mind, but I was thinking about well-written books about public administration that take tricky concepts and communicate them very clearly. So a book on bureaucratic rulemaking by Rachel Augustine Potter called Bending the Rules. Amy Lerman's book about trust in government came out shortly before ours. Sally Numa her book came out right around the same time as ours, but she had done some really great writing around sort of trust in government among Black communities. And I think those are what I had in mind when we were writing.
Fantastic. Some incredible books I want to check out. So let's dive into your book. What would you say is the thesis or the central argument for Prophets of Distrust?
Your review of our book really picked it up pretty nicely, which is at one level, this book is about water, but at a deeper level, it's really about democracy. It's really about governance and how those two things speak to each other. It is at the very core of democratic theory is the idea that governments gain their legitimacy and they lose their legitimacy by providing for their population's basic needs. That was the revolutionary spark at the beginning of the democratic age. It's right there in the Declaration of Independence. So all we're doing is taking that basic idea underlying liberal democracy and pointing out that the most basic of basic services is water. And we live in this time of declining and very low levels of trust in our democratic institutions. At that same time, we've seen a rise in the bottled water industry and declining trust in tap water. So our basic argument is that these two things relate to one another, and people's experiences of basic services feed into their perceptions of and their relationships with government. And those relationships and perceptions then turn around and feed back into their willingness to support investments in those basic services. So this kind of cyclical relationship between people and the state, and that takes the form of the water that enters their homes and that they experience every day.
I'll say another thing too, and I don't think it's necessarily the thesis of the book, but it's to me one of the most important takeaways, which is it's not okay to be good enough for some people all of the time. And I think we've seen this with Flint. I think we're seeing it with Jackson, right? That most of the water in the United States is good, right? The vast majority of utilities are supplying excellent quality water, but that's not good enough for maintaining trust, right? You also need you need it to be good everywhere for people to trust, because they observe a failure somewhere else and they're going to think that their water is not clean, right? And so I wouldn't say that's the thesis of the book, but I think it's to me one of the things that's really stuck with me the most is we know that we're all heavily involved in the water world. We know that drinking water for the most part in the United States is good. The problem is that for the most part. And that's where, we've really seen run into trouble. And I think that's a lot of the source of the distrust in drinking water in the United States right now is, that for the most part. And so that's another thing I would really say is a big takeaway.
I'm so glad you raised that issue and that relationship between government and water, because and maybe it's because I run a water utility that's its own government rather than part of a larger government. But I spend so much of my time focused on governance and on the relationship between representative democracy, the citizen owners or the consumer owners of my utility, and thinking about the community standards that they require. But what you said, David, is so it's one of those things that really drew my attention in almost a frightening way, is that even if you capture that, and you are one of those vast majority of utilities that provide that high quality, safe water, the failures where that isn't, it can directly impact your ability to provide that service and offset the need or the perceived need for your customers to go elsewhere and spend thousands of percent more for a less high quality and less high regulated service. Getting back to you guys, you're not interviewing me.
No. Listen, this is a
really
conversation. One of the things that stood out in our book, we've already talked a little bit about Flint, was the way that the Flint water crisis changed relationships with water everywhere across the country. We're all Flint now. If you run a water system and this topic comes up, whether it's Flint or Jackson or anywhere else where there's been a severe drinking water crisis, that's what people are going to talk about. It doesn't matter that you're 1,000 miles away. It's whether people can relate to it. And some of the really eye-opening findings of our book have to do with just how contagious that distrust is over long geographic distances.
And we think about contagiousness all the time in terms of public health and water quality, but this is another type of contagion in terms of the reputation of water, separate from the actual ions in the system. I wanted to maybe dive into that just a little bit, because this was one of my favorite attributes of your book, was its relationship between water and politics. At one point in the book, you say, and I quote, "American political development is in many ways a story of water infrastructure development." Which just a statement that I loved. But that said, I was trying to think of the last time, and I couldn't think of a time when I turned on the news and saw a political reporter talk about water infrastructure, unless there's a disaster and with good video, right? Flooding or something like that. So are the stories of American political development and water infrastructure development still the same? Are they still aligned, or have these stories in some ways diverged?
They, in one way, are still aligned, and in another way have diverged. They're aligned insofar as government's reputation is still tied to the quality of water and sewer infrastructure and flood control and all the other aspects by which water affects our daily lives. The difference is the political game 100 years ago, 150 years ago, was what political scientists would call a credit claiming opportunity for politicians. Whether we're talking about ancient China, ancient Rome, whatever, politicians like to claim credit for good things, and water is a great way to claim credit. And so you'd build this monumental architecture to provide people with this good. It was the same thing in America in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It was this magnificent credit claiming opportunity. You used to have to pump water with this hand pump in your yard. Now you've got indoor potable water 24 hours a day. It's a miracle to people who experience that. So that part hasn't changed. What's changed is the game has turned from credit claiming for politicians to what political scientists would call blame avoidance. So the game for a politician now is not to claim credit for the great service we're bringing you, but rather to avoid blame for the disaster that could happen or might happen. And so if the game is blame avoidance, the incentives are very different.
I'll go a step further, Manny, and say it's not even always. Sometimes the problem isn't that it's blame avoidance for the disaster. It's blame avoidance for the visible rate increase that people are going to see on their bill. And therefore, I'm going to oppose a rate increase because I'm afraid that's going to hurt my political viability, not being cognizant of the risk that you're increasing by putting off important investment in water infrastructure, right? So I think even the blame avoidance, yes, it's wanting to avoid blame for the big things. But I think the insidious thing is actually wanting to avoid the blame for the small things that then contribute directly to those big failures.
Well, and then a consequence of that, right, is that people only hear about tap water when there's something wrong with it. They don't necessarily stop to think that, oh, like my tap water turned on today, there's no one celebrating that achievement. And what ends up happening is people hear about these disasters elsewhere. There's this vacuum of communication within their own local community, and they kind of come to their own conclusions about the safety of their own local tap water.
Well, you guys are speaking directly to my heart. I mean, it feels like the only time we get a community conversation is one, if there's, something that occurs that we need to respond to, or a rate increase, right? While on a daily basis is miracle of modern civilization, just tap water that you can drink coming straight out of your tap isn't something that people are constantly saying, wow, that's great. The other thing I really loved about your study, many things, is water kiosks. Your study of water kiosks and their relationship to the socioeconomic status of the communities in which they're located. You have these wonderful maps. In fact, it made me want to find out where all my water kiosks are located in my service area. What made you focus on water kiosks? And I'm also kind of curious the relationship between freestanding kiosks and those water stores you often see in strip malls. Are they different versions of the same business model, or are they different?
So I guess the focus on water kiosks came about because both Manny and I, and David too, but Manny and I in particular, were transplants to Texas. And in Texas, water kiosks like the ones we study in the book are pretty common. So it's pretty routine to drive down the road and see these very brightly colored, kind of oddly shaped little water vending machines in parking lots. And when I went to Texas to start grad school working with Manny, the first assignment he gave me was, why don't you look into these water kiosks? These things are pretty weird. And so that's kind of where that came from, because I'm from like close to Saratoga Springs, which is people bring, empty containers and fill things up from natural water supplies. But to me, there's something unique about the fact that it's like a mineral spring water. And with these kiosks, there were so many of them. They were so expensive, and they were locating in places that have pretty high quality tap water, like Houston. And so we really started exploring where these things were, and we worked with a team of undergraduate students at Texas A&M to help collect the locations of them from around the country. And the way we did that process was with the help of Google Maps and Google Street View. And so one of the really cool things about that data collection effort was that we essentially had, 6 undergraduate students doing fieldwork all over the country just by clicking through computer imagery. And what we came to realize is that a lot of kiosks were located in low-income parking lots or Hispanic food market parking lots. The other kind of thing that piqued our interest about the kiosks was the students themselves. So many of them were first-generation students. Texas A&M is a Hispanic serving institution, so a lot of them were Hispanic or had family that had come from a different country originally. And when we introduced the project to them, they looked at us like we were crazy. They were like, why are we studying these things? Like, this is where we buy our water from. Like, this is where I buy my water, before band practice and sports practice. And so that was kind of another clue that there was something going on that was maybe unique to these kiosks as they relate to kind of the mom and pop water shops. Just in that phrasing itself, right? These sort of standalone storefronts, I do think tend to be owned as like independent companies. Many of the kiosks that we study in the book are franchises. And so they kind of have this larger corporate structure. We chose to focus on these franchises as opposed to kind of mom and pop stores or primo kiosks that you might see in a Walmart or an H-E-B or a large grocery store, because we felt like there was something unique about driving up to purchase solely water, as opposed to while you're doing your grocery shopping trip, you just add on water as one additional item. So that's kind of the background. Manny or David, am I forgetting anything?
You're not forgetting anything. I just want to highlight 2 things that I think are so interesting about. Sam told you about the origin story of this project, which is absolutely right. And I think it's a wonderful example of things that you notice about a place when you are not native to that place.
Yes.
Because for Sam and I, who had come from, I grew up in Seattle. Sam grew up in central New York. These are these kiosks are just not things that we had ever seen or experienced before, and they seemed weird to us, but to the people who were born and raised in Texas, that was just normal. They didn't even notice them. Nothing was weird about that. So and all of us have these blind spots in our everyday lives, things that are just normal to us, but someone who comes from a different area might look at it and think, this is strange, this is weird, can you explain it to me? And we would have no way to understand it. The other thing that's cool about kiosks, as a nice complement to our analysis of bottled water, is that kiosks are fixed in geographic space, which unlike a case of bottled water, which can drive around and go to different places in the back of someone's car, a water kiosk, as Sam indicated, is a thing where people go to it with one purpose and one purpose only, right? I'm there for drinking water. And so that its location in a specific spot tells us something about the kinds of customers that the kiosk owner expects to serve. So if we see a kiosk in a particular kind of neighborhood, say a neighborhood with a high poverty level, these things are often located, as Sam said, in these sort of like strip malls that had a lot of other sort of Hispanic serving stores. They often were the same parking lot dollar stores and other kind of discount stores. That told us something about the people who these kiosks serve. And then later, more sophisticated statistical analysis of census data affirmed those findings. But going in, Sam and I had just no idea what these things were. Like, we had no idea why they were there, what they were doing. And so this whole thing started as a project just to try to understand this weird phenomenon.
Incredible. Speaking to kind of the particular leading to the broader context, we already discussed earlier Flint, Michigan as being such a major touchstone on recent drinking water distrust due to its lead contamination crisis. You also mention in the book and explore in the book Southern Black, Appalachian, Southwestern Hispanic communities and their particular experiences with drinking water. How did you weave these specific instances of identity, government failure, alienation into your overall thesis on drinking water and democracy? Or how did these particular instances actually lead you to that, to your thesis?
I'll start by saying that I think one of the main drivers for wanting to focus on those areas is we really wanted to make the point that there are very genuine, rational reasons for folks to distrust the government, right? It's easy for you to maybe even read the title of our book and think, oh, like, well, tap water is just safe, right? This is just a problem of trust. And it's a little bit deeper than that, right? It's that for certain groups of people that have been historically neglected or marginalized by government, there's like a rational reason to choose to question the safety of the water that's coming out of your taps.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Nobody in our account is crazy or stupid or ill-informed. We think these are all rational decisions. And so tracing those histories of marginalization to present perceptions of government service, it was really central to our account. And I think that's something that when we really are in many ways speaking to the professional water community in this way. I think there's a lot of folks, and I work with them all the time, folks like who work in your kind of position, Justin, who think that this is a messaging problem.
Yep.
Right? And it is. It is at one level a messaging problem, but it's not only a messaging problem. And that's where we're trying to point out that like people are not making foolish decisions; they're making rational decisions. So to help improve things, we need to change the conditions of that rationality. If that makes sense.
And the focus on the three areas, the Southwest, sort of American South, and Appalachia, was to sort of illustrate the point that depending on where you are in the country sort of determines who at what point was marginalized or neglected. And so to kind of illustrate this common theme of the impacts of marginalization and neglect.
It does speak directly to maybe a unintentional blindness in the water industry, that we're separate from politics and from all of that. We just provide water, and it's a straightforward and intentional thing rather than having to deal with things outside of our control. Especially engineers, they hate dealing with things outside of their control, right? In describing what you call, and I love this phrase and I love the image of it that you have in multiple places in the book, the vicious cycle of distrust. It is something that's been haunting me. You delve into all these various areas, and we talked about this earlier, economics, social science, psychology, political theory, all these academic pursuits that may have a hard time speaking to the general audience. And as you mentioned, Sam, you at some times during the book, you warned non-scholars away from areas that were a bit theoretical. I really appreciated that. Of course, it kind of drew me in a little bit. It's like, oh, I'm going to give it my shot, and then I come across these conceptual graphs that I'm still trying to get my head around. So are you generally concerned about how to communicate academic research to the general reader? And you already raised it yourself, so I assume you are, especially on topics so important to all of us as basic services and democracy. How do we connect the rich understanding in the academy, in the university fields, and all of these various areas to the practitioners as well as to those who are consuming water and owning their own water systems?
Well, I don't have a perfect answer for this. I think Manny has perhaps the most experience in this, but I'll talk about a failure of mine that has taught me a lot of lessons, which is I'm actually a member of the Water and Light Advisory Board for the City of Columbia. And we were going through a water rate increase, and I took it upon myself to go in front of City Council, and I went into a very academic description of water affordability and water rates and what it means to have an inclining block rate. And I said one little offhanded thing, and that's all they took away from it. I talked about the nature of our tier 2 rate was kind of messed up. It didn't make a lot of sense. And they ignored every single other thing I said and focused on this one thing. And so I think to me that was actually a lesson about, clear takeaways, right? And being very deliberate in the way that you communicate the information. And I think, a lot of, and Manny's done the brunt of this work. I think a lot of Manny's blogging and communication has definitely focused on that, right? I mean, I think even Manny on your blog, each of your pieces is one clear, usually bolded thesis, right? That like, this is the takeaway. And so, I think that's hard to do in a book, right? One clear thesis. And of course, at the beginning of this podcast, you asked us, what is the one takeaway? And I, of course, added a second. But, I do think, just kind of, I think academics often have a hard time getting to the point in their writing and their communicating. And so, I hope to some extent, I think even in reiterating the vicious cycle each chapter and highlighting where does this fit in, that's kind of where we're trying to get, the reader to kind of focus in on that one aspect. I don't know if Manny has anything to add. I just, I was thinking about my own failure in communicating with officials that we want to meet. And it was definitely a lesson for me in how to better communicate. I think I've done a better job in more recent areas with council, but
I think David's being awfully hard on himself here.
Yes.
I think that David does a tremendous amount of work and service to Columbia in that capacity on that board. Look, I mean, for those of us, and I think all three of us fit the bill, those of us who want our research to count for something other than publications that go onto our CVs, that translational work is central, and it's critical to what we do. I'm never going to apologize. I'm pretty sure I speak safely for Sam and David here. We're not going to apologize for doing good, rigorous academic work. It's what makes our findings solid, reliable. It's why I can speak with confidence to a practitioner's audience that what I say is true is we have put the work in, tracing out the logic, finding the data, finding the evidence to demonstrate that what we think is true, and find places where we are wrong and need to refine our understanding. But translating that into a practitioner or a public-facing piece is a challenge, because what you don't want to do is dumb things down, right? We never want to dumb it down. This is a big, complicated issue, so you don't want to oversimplify. But at the same time, you can't make everything a 300-page treatise, or no one's going to pay attention to you. So I think the challenge is to try to come with those clear takeaways. It's why we end the book with this afterword that we call the plan, where we're trying to give people very clear, actionable outcomes. We get to a lot of that in the introductory chapter, and also in the concluding chapter. We kind of pull back from the the very fine-grained academic language and try to make things at least a little more broadly applicable. But it's an ongoing challenge. But in the end, I think that's why all of us are in this game, right? We enjoy being scholars, but there are some scholars who are perfectly content to write a fancy journal article that a dozen other people will read, and it's fine to do that. But what gets me out of bed in the morning is the chance that the research will make a difference in people's lives.
Hear, hear. And I would deeply appreciate all three of you being willing to do that. And I mentioned in the review on the water shelf how many different places in the book he provides those signposts and assistance, the plan. It is very well organized to be approachable from all various aspects of water industry or just water interest, as well as academic work. I was just curious have you guys ever thought of creating maybe a cheat sheet or even a poster or something like that of the vicious cycle of distrust and how you turn it over into a virtuous cycle of trust, with something to put on the wall to kind of look at and think about like I currently have my mission statement and vision statement and goals, that sort of thing? Or is that a bad idea?
You should take that one, Manny.
I hadn't thought about a poster version of the cycle, the vicious and the virtuous cycle. For those of you who are listening who haven't read the book, most of the book is centered around this vicious cycle of distrust that connects distrust in tap water to declining participation in democracy and further erosion of quality. And then we talk about how you can flip that around and make it virtuous. That's an interesting idea, and then one that we'll maybe explore. We have all between the three of us talked a lot about more ways to get the core messages out, whether it means whether we're talking about through video or through a podcast or whatnot. But I'm excited to share one project that's currently underway, which is a comic book adaptation of The Prophets of Distrust.
Oh, I can't wait. Oh my goodness.
It is currently in development, but we are working with a company called Sequential Potential that specializes in translating academic research into comic books. So we will have the comic book / graphic novel version of The Prophets of Distrust, hopefully later this year.
That is exciting. I cannot wait to see that. And then, if you ever get to the point of, creating a bill insert version of it, because I know that is the one communication device that all of my customers read. It is the bill, and sometimes even the inserts. So that is one also potential communication vehicle. I'm always talking to our customers. I was kind of raised in our public affairs area, moving up, and I always tell our team that one of our primary communication vehicles is our bill. Stepping back a little bit to kind of, again, to the context of your book, what books would you like to see, next to your book on the virtual water shelf or the idealized water shelf? Are there specific books out there or bodies of work that you think would pair well with yours, that you see in dialogue with Prophets of Distrust, either reinforcing or challenging each other's arguments?
Well, I'll say that it was flattering to be in your top 10. There's some really pretty hefty titles there by some pretty smart folks, and so that was fun. It was very, very
well deserved,
flattering.
Well deserved.
Thanks. I think at some point or other, most folks who studied water, read Reisner's Cadillac Desert and found it inspiring or depressing in one way or another, and in any case, sort of like instigating. I know all three of us have read that book, and so to see our title on the same list is fun. I think you can think of our work as contributing to an academic body of research on the relationship between public administration and trust in government, and then you can see our work as contributing to water. We see ourselves joining a long conversation in the theoretical research around a book that we cite in our book and that has spawned a lot of work, which is a book called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty by Albert Hirschman, and that is about how people respond to in situations where they are unhappy. And we think that we have something to say to a long line of research in that tradition in economics and sociology and political science. And then with water, yeah, we think we're part of that conversation with some of the titles in your top 20. I think we offer an interesting, different take to Seth Siegel's book on, Seth Siegel's Troubled Water, which I thought was an interesting book. I've talked with Seth about it. His is fundamentally, I think it's fair to say, fundamentally a very pessimistic take on the American water sector. It's in the state of the American water sector and its prospects for the future. There's a lot troubling in our book too, but I think we're fundamentally hopeful. At least we see the potential, and that the challenges we face with water in America are soluble, right? These are not intractable problems. It's their very tractability that make them so important for democracy. This is not, we close the book by making this point. This is not like trying to cure cancer or solve global climate change or nuclear proliferation, or these other challenges that are just so difficult. The challenges that we face in the water sector are principally institutional. They're principally organizational. They're challenges that we know how to overcome. So we have so much more hope, I think, than some of the takes out there that sort of want to say everything's broken.
I think that's a wonderful place to start to draw to a close, because I think you do find, a lot of naysayers and a lot of positive people without any substance to them. But you guys are my third interview, and Peter Glick, Erica Geis, they were both incredibly hopeful in terms of the future prospects for water generally, and your book as well. There's a lot of opportunities out there. So speaking to that, I'm very interested in you mentioned right at the very beginning about the reception of the book being well received. I'd like to hear just at the end just a little bit of how's the book been received? Where is it being talked about or discussed or taught? What's the current trajectory of Prophets of Distrust?
I guess this is me again. I feel like I'm dominating the conversation. Look, I have been very, all of us participate in conferences. I probably participate in more water events than maybe Sam and David do at this stage. But every time I go to a water conference, whether it's AWWA or NACWA or WEF, any of these water sector organizations, AMWA, folks now walk up to me and tell me they've read the book, or that they've got the book. I've had a number of folks in your position, Justin, people who run water utilities. I've had at least 3 of them now tell me that they read the book and then purchased copies for all their board members.
That's so great. I should
because they think it's important for their board to understand this story. And I think that speaks to something that David brought up earlier, which is trying to understand how the quality relates to trust and maybe some of the dangers of always putting, rates first, and ignoring quality until it's too late. So I think that as far as the water sector goes, the book has been very well received in that sense. People are very nice. So people who hate the book tend to not walk up to you at conferences and say, I hated your book. You're an idiot and you should think about quitting your day job, right? So I can't say that we have rigorous evidence that the book's well received, but it's been reviewed nicely and including by you, so thank you. But I think that in particular, the book has really resonated with the people who run these systems and the people who deal with these challenges every day. So that's been quite gratifying.
Wonderful.
The other perspective I'll add is that I guest lecture on this book quite a bit in undergrad classes, both at here at Iowa and then at other institutions. And the argument is really well received by students. And I think in part that's because water is such a tangible thing where, everybody knows what water is and everyone's heard of Flint. And so everyone kind of has this lived experience with water in a way that other topic areas in environmental politics you don't have. And then I think the other reason that students really connect with it is to the point that Manny made about the optimism behind it, right? Like, this is a pretty fixable technical problem in many ways. And I think students are really attracted to that, especially in kind of the national conversation around the pessimism of like other environmental problems. And so that, I think, is another reason for to be hopeful about stuff.
Here. David, any final words?
I mean, I think I have guest lectured less on it, less than Sam, and I've gone to fewer conferences than Manny. But typically, when people have reached out or contacted me, it's been a positive thing. I've been to a couple of water conferences since the book has come out, and I think it's been well received. But I think both of them can speak better to that than I can.
Your service on the board, I served on our local Board of Public Utilities for 8 years. First off, Dave, thank you for that service. But also, I think having these discussions that is either generated or informed by this book, and hopefully more to come, will really focus our attentions on the importance of general water quality and highest level of services, and of how affordability and all of these various aspects that we think about on a daily basis from the management side, but need all the leadership and well as the academic community to be very focused on it. And I think your book just adds such a tremendous amount of knowledge and thought. I said in my review, every water manager, as well as frankly every drinker of water, all of it should have this book on their shelves if they could, or at least talk about the incredibly important aspects of this book. I'll leave it there and say that we've been speaking with Drs. Manuel Teodoro, Samantha Zuhlke, and David Switzer about their recently published book, The Profits of Distrust, Citizen Consumers, Drinking Water, and the Crisis of Confidence in American Government, published by Cambridge University Press in 2022, available wherever you find books. Thank you all so much for participating on the Water Shelf podcast, and I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Thanks, Justin.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for listening to another episode of The Water Shelf. For water book news and reviews, and to sign up for our newsletter, please visit the Water Shelf website at mavensnotebook.com/watershelf. Maven's Notebook is the place to stay up to date on California water news and information. Subscribe to weekly or daily emails at mavensnotebook.com. Finally, please support authors by filling your water shelf with their amazing books. Buy them at your local bookseller and let me know what you think. Until next time, thank you for listening and happy water reading.